A very good evening and a warm welcome to Hyde Park. Tonight we will talk about Sri Lanka's foreign affairs relations, where Sri Lanka stands in the international arena. And to discuss all this, we've invited to our studios a prominent former diplomat of the country who has represented Sri Lanka in the United Nations, the United States, in China, and who was also a secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs previously. Let me warmly welcome the chairman of the Pathfinder Association, Mr. Bernard Goonetilleke.
Pathfinder Foundation,
Pathfinder Foundation,
yes.
I beg
Thank
your
you
pardon.
very much.
Thank you very much for joining us at Hyde Park. Mr. Goonetilleke, I think you were the Sri Lankan ambassador to the US between the period from 2005 to 2008. This was when Sri Lanka was first made eligible to obtain the Millennium Challenge Corporation Fund, but it was after that discussions began, and Sri Lanka was also this facility was withdrawn from Sri Lanka at certain points. But if you may remind us how Sri Lanka became eligible for this fund and how discussions have taken.
Well, in the original program, grant program by the United States was first conceived in 2002 during President Bush's time, and it was brought into force around 2004, at which point Sri Lanka was eligible, and the eligibility was confirmed in March 2006. There were about dozen or more Asian, African and Latin American countries that became eligible. This eligibility is basically done on the basis of what shall I say, details provided by the World Bank. They call it gross national income.
Right.
From time to time that GNI figures change. So initially in 2006 it would have been a different figure, and we very easily came within that, and the internal climate of the country, the peace process that was going around at that time facilitated that kind of a decision. So in 2006 we were selected, and actually there was a briefing of the by the Department of State at that time given to the eligible countries, and Sri Lanka was included, and I represented Sri Lanka at that time. So that is my first initiation to the Millennium Challenge account.
It was previously called Millennium Challenge account.
It was called Millennium Challenge account, MCA. Later it was changed to MCC. I can't really remember when it was really changed.
What was the level of engagement you had in terms of, were you part of the negotiation table for Sri Lanka? How was your involvement?
You see, what happens is when the country is selected, they decide also on a team of officials from the MCC, and they negotiate with the local authorities. At that time, it was the Ministry of Finance, the focal point here in Sri Lanka, and there were officials who came up with various suggestions as to where possible grant monies could go to. And I can't really remember what were their proposals at this point of time. That was a long time ago. And there were negotiations, and based on those negotiations, actually MCC teams used to visit Colombo, have discussions, and then go back and try to put a package. And my recollection is at that time also it was something like in excess of $400 million that was
at the time
targeted.
Do you recall their goal in terms of extending this grant to Sri Lanka, what the initial idea was?
It's basically, from the very beginning, they had three areas or criteria. One is ruling justly, two is investing in people, Three was fostering economic freedom. So those were the three areas United States were looking for. In addition to that of course, as I said earlier, that was the time peace process was going on. There was no fighting, at least on the surface, and it became possible for the United States to consider Sri Lanka as a suitable country to receive this grant aid based on the background of the country at that particular time, and also the fact that these facilities are given for lower income group people, countries rather, as well as lower middle income group people, countries.
But there was concern raised within the country back then too about the compact?
Yes. So what happened actually was between 2006 and 2008. 2008 was the time when the compact was withdrawn. There was the peace process basically came to an end. A new government came into existence here in Sri Lanka, and there were skirmishes between the government and the LTTE, and then that became an opportunity for the expatriate Tamils in the United States, maybe even from Europe, I do not know, to make representations to the US administration, particularly to the congressmen and to senators, with regard to the ground situation in Sri Lanka. And of course, when the fighting became intensified in 2006 onwards, the US found it difficult, or thought it would be difficult to give effect to this particular compact because of the ground situation. So sometime in, I think, early or middle of early part of 2008, they said they will withdraw the offer, and we were removed from the recipients list.
Right.
So that is what happened. And between then 2008 until 2016-17, there was no consideration. Sri Lanka was not in, although we were within that particular income group. Ground situation was not suitable, but the situation that changed since 2015 made it possible for the US to have a re-look at the country, and that is what happened. And 2017 we were taken in once again, and 2018 we should have been included into the list, but because of the problems what we had in October, internal political problem, they were not able to include Sri Lanka in the list. And I think March or April 2019 we were included once again.
And now the deadline for accepting this grant by the Sri Lankan side is looming. It's around the corner. What has your concerns been? Because you have seen this MCC compact when it was Millennium Challenge account to Millennium Challenge Corporation. From then to now, you do have an understanding of certain elements of this grant, this compact. What are your key concerns?
Well, what happens is, in 2009, Sri Lanka moved from the applicable list from a middle income to upper lower upper income group. So for which income was something like $3,995, we have surpassed it, and therefore we will now, if we lose this particular opportunity, we will not be considered again unless they revise their figure of that applicable figure of 3,995.
But isn't this a very tight timing for Sri Lanka to decide on whether we go ahead with such an agreement or not, especially because there is a lot of controversy surrounding this compact. There is a lot of opposition, and also this fund, this grant has been extended to Sri Lanka at certain times and withdrawn. And we see that the withdrawal happens at particular periods in the Sri Lankan history, where when the previous government, when they were in power, the eligibility was no longer available for Sri Lanka. And again, shortly during the October period, Sri Lanka once again was not eligible to have this deal.
There's a slight difference. In the situation, when we go back to 2008, it was the ground situation and recommencement of fighting that made it not possible for the MCC to go ahead with that. Now, in this particular instance, April 2019, they have agreed to provide $480 million of grant aid. Not a loan, it is totally free money. And it is Sri Lanka at this point of time is in a quandary or not decisive whether we should accept what has been offered. So in that respect, it is different from what it was in 2008. In this kind of situation, we are not sure whether we are going to accept it or not. But the money is available. Projects have been conceived. Both Sri Lankan side government and the MCC have come to an understanding with regard to where the money should go. $350 million for transportation system and $167 million for land related activities. So the difference, as I said, is earlier they said no, this time Sri Lanka says no, most likely it is going to say no.
But the government has shown a lot of interest in moving ahead with this deal. But what's the problem here, especially the controversy surrounding the land, the clauses on land? What is really the concerning part here for Sri Lanka?
Before land actually going into transport system, that is the bulk of the money is going for that. We have to understand where these monies are targeted. It is, according to the project, $160 million will go for traffic management and $50 million for bus service modernization and $140 million for rural road development. So now, for example, today to come from my office to this place, it is 6 kilometers and took me 45 minutes. We have office workers who come from Piliyandala to the place where we are working at this point of time. Distance is not more than 15-20 kilometers, but it takes 3 hours. That is the distance what we take, normal time what we take from Colombo to Kandy.
Yes.
So traffic situation is not something that will not settle by its own. We will have to come up with solutions to address the traffic system. So taking care of or improving the bus services or rural roads is something very important. Now, in the case of land, it is something different. That is, of course, the money is targeted for that particular activity is not much. It is $67 million. Of that, 23.4 million goes for mapping and surveying of government and private land, and 6.5 million goes for strengthening capacity of government to accurately assess state and private land. Then another 11.4 million goes for training and equipment, and finally research and support measures 6.7 million. Now I will take one example with regard to the capacity of government to accurately assess state and private land. 2-3 years ago, our company purchased a land in the eastern province, X number of acreage. Very interestingly, the deeds were done all by a very prominent leading company in Sri Lanka, a best name you can think of. So to purchase the land, we went to the Pradesi Sabha, got the street line certificate from them, got the non-vesting certificate from them, went ahead with the purchase. Couple of months later, we were trying to put a board to say this property belongs to this particular company. And the land officer, having seen the board, demanded that it should be removed. We asked why. They said this is state land. So we said nonsense, it is not state land, this is private land. Our company purchased this after getting cleared by the Pradesi Sabha. Then he says, we don't care what the Pradesi Sabha says. According to our records, this is government land. So in the end, we lose the land, we lose the money what we paid, because state, one arm of the state does not know whether that particular parcel belongs to the state or belongs to a private party. So this is the kind of situations what we have, and in that kind of situations, it becomes very difficult for a private party to go and purchase a block of land, private, so-called private land, not knowing at what point the government would come and claim that land, because there is a grey area between the records kept by the government alone. So it is very important that this kind of activity be undertaken, so the government knows what exactly is government, and private people, individuals know what belongs to them, and there is no interference between the two parties.
Right, I'd like to talk more on this topic, but shortly after a break. To stay with us at Hyde Park. Welcome back. At Hyde Park tonight, we're in discussion with a former Sri Lankan diplomat, Mr. Bernard Goonetilleke. You were explaining at length about your understanding on the MCC compact, and since Sri Lanka was first made eligible for the program, and while the days are numbered for Sri Lanka to either decide whether we go in with the agreement or not, I'd also like to touch a little more specifically on the concerns of land, because this is a very sensitive and controversial topic for us here in Sri Lanka. What is your opinion about this? Because there is a lot of concern that this agreement will allow Sri Lanka or foreign nations to possess lands or take over lands in Sri Lanka.
Land issue is an emotional issue for most of Sri Lankans, if not all Sri Lankans. There is always the fear that the foreigners are waiting to grab our ports, airports, lands, etc. and etc. One reason may be the fact the Sri Lanka as a whole is a small land area. Population is getting bigger and bigger, and the availability of land becomes a problem. So first question with regard to the foreigners coming and buying lands, that has been associated with the fact that this proposed land arrangement under the MCC project, by the way, something that has been proposed by the government of Sri Lanka, not the US has proposed.
This land matter was a Sri Lankan proposal?
Actually, both the land as well as the transport project, both projects are proposals that were put forward, among others, to the MCC by Sri Lankan side, of which they have selected these two. And so, in fact, the ownership of the two projects are fully with Sri Lanka, not with the US. So one fear is that the land will be available for foreigners to purchase. That means, for example, land that has been given to a farmer, whether it is 5 acres those days or 2 acres now, is being given not an outright grant, but in a way that you will hold the land. You cannot sell the land to a third party. There is a regulation against selling land to foreigners in Sri Lanka. That we have to remember. Second thing is, no foreign company will be interested in buying half an acre, 1 acre or 2 acre of land at a time, with the intention of at some future point having some business arrangement out of that. The possible way of doing it, they can with a proposal go to the government and get a block of land on lease to grow bananas or to grow something else, so long as the lease is the valid period of the lease. If it is the government, you remember, for example, many years ago, for the Voice of America, the United States negotiated with the government, paid X amount of money to the government. First it was at Sidur, and then they gave that land way back to the government and went to some other place. So that was government to government negotiation. So if foreign governments need land, there is a way to negotiate with the government and get it on lease. If foreign companies are interested, there is also a way of getting land from the government on lease through joint ventures or whatever the means possible. So this fear of foreigners coming and buying 2 acres of land at a time and trying to dispossess Sri Lankan farmers is something in the minds of our
Are you saying
people.
there is no threat?
Well, there is no threat in the sense, again I'm going to ask you, will you be going and buying 2 acres of land in Africa, in Zimbabwe?
But there is a strategic interest of these in Sri Lanka.
Now we are bringing strategic interest into the subject. First is, this thing was whether it was for commercial purposes, agricultural land taken for commercial purpose or similar activities. If you are talking of strategic thing, okay, we can say Hambantota Harbour is a strategic thing. 15,000 acres of land China is requesting from government to have an industrial estate could be a strategic thing. Getting a 2 acre plot to half acre plot is not strategic, at least according to my thinking and understanding.
But in Sri Lanka, as a country, a destination where they hold highly strategic, don't you think there will be any engagement? Because are you saying there's no base for any of these underlying fears?
Well, fear is something in the mind, but we have not seen exactly on the ground. Again, I am going back to Hambantota or Mattala Airport. Those are strategic. If you are talking of buying half an acre or 40 purchase or 2 acres, that cannot fall into the broad description of a strategic. Yes, Sri Lanka is located in a strategic place in the world, in the Indian Ocean. That is a proper description. That also we discovered, or the world discovered, after 2009. Until 2009, when the United States Senate sent a 2-member team to Sri Lanka to study the situation after the end of the conflict, they wrote a report. It is on the web, anybody can read it. They explained that US should not ignore Sri Lanka because of strategic importance of the country from security point of view. A very fine argument, which is a fact. But until 2009, United States never gave a tuppence to Sri Lanka so far as strategic situation is concerned. Why? Because it was the strategic interest came into being with China's emergence as a military power as well as economic power. And that was when, around that time, 2009, 2010, China showed its interest in the Indian Ocean, started coming into the Indian Ocean, which was basically a playground of the European powers since colonial time for the last 500 years or whatever it is. So the strategic importance of Sri Lanka became visible post 2009 period in my thinking. But of course, if you look at India, it is a different situation. Strategic interest of Sri Lanka, so far as India was concerned, it was always there because of the proximity. So going back to this land thing, there was this fear of private land being purchased by others, particularly foreigners. If you went and buy and I go and buy, it's a different matter. Expecting foreigners to go and purchase those farmland is not something realistic from my point of view. But there were other issues, such as there is a railroad that's going to be constructed between Colombo and Trincomalee, and thereby divide the country north and the south. And the north, the US take it, and south, I don't know who is going to take the south. So these are all quite imaginative kind of arguments. From my point of view, a railroad or a road does not divide a country, but it connects a country from point A to point B.
But with the US pushing Sri Lanka to accept the funds that they are extending towards transport and land, again, I'd like to ask you, so that we clarify all these concerns that the people have, that is opposition to entering these agreements with the United States. Why is it that the United States is so interested in Sri Lanka accepting this compact at this point, because Sri Lanka has been really eligible for this since 2006, 7, if I'm not mistaken.
No, 2006 to 2008 eligible. Thereafter, we fell out of the came out of the list, and then again it went back into list in 2007 for 2018. So now, if you ask this, if I am in the US side, not on the Sri Lankan side, and if you ask this question, my response would be this: if you do not want this $480 million, which you have negotiated with us for 2 years or over a period of 18 months, please say so. We have other countries to whom we could provide. For example, I can tell you, there were several countries that were provided with MCC funds for the first time, and 3 countries I know, no, 4 countries I think, 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Senegal and Mongolia were 3 countries who went for seconds, and now they are in line to receive funding for the second time. So one should ask the question whether the US forced this money to any country, including Sri Lanka. I don't think US forced anything. US is aware of the fact, and as much as we do, that Sri Lanka asked for this money, we negotiated, and the US provided the money. If you wish to have, you can have it. If you do not, please tell us. We will channel this money to some other deserving country.
The president of Sri Lanka is of the view that the government should be kept from entering this agreement at this point. He believes that it should be left a matter for the incoming government, but we don't have time until then.
I really do not know the answer to this question, because next board meeting of the MCC is going to meet within a couple of days' time, mid-September. There is no hard and fast rule to say at that time we must say yes or no.
Okay.
It is the board which will decide. Board will take into consideration that Sri Lanka in throes of this political upheaval, getting ready for a series of elections, and maybe they will, if they so decide, they will say, okay, we will wait for 2 months, 3 months, or whatever it is. On our part, the President of Sri Lanka could say, I am not going to approve it. I will not be the one. It will be the future president. So he is very well entitled to say that. I am not inclined to sign it. Let the future president decide on it. But the fact of the matter, rather unfortunate fact, is that because of this prevarication, delaying tactics, or not making up your mind, may or might result in our losing this 480 million, which is almost close to $500 million for Sri Lanka. At a time, our coffers are basically empty, our roads are chock-a-block, and very recently I was made to understand that the Moratuwa University has made some studies and come to the conclusion that during the year 2020, that is next year, Sri Lanka will lose 1.8 billion rupees due to traffic stagnation. So that is basically diesel and petrol going through the tail tubes of vehicles, and that many man hours will also be lost because we are not in a position, or we have not taken the opportunity to address the traffic situation in the country.
Again, my question to you, Mr. Goonetilleke, is whether there is no space through this agreement to jeopardize Sri Lanka's security or national interest or sovereignty.
I will put it in this way: to jeopardize Sri Lanka's national security through MCC, I am confident the answer is no. But there may be other arrangements Sri Lanka's, on Sri Lanka's table that may perhaps affect Sri Lanka's national interest.
Shall we talk about those
well, if you wish to
agreements?
Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest threat at this point in time for Sri Lanka? What should we be worried about if MCC or if any of these funds that will benefit Sri Lanka's transport, land, and address some of the burning issues of the country should not be the concern? What is the concern in your point of view?
Well, today we are discussing about various other agreements. Unfortunately, MCC thing, although not planned, came into focus at a time when we were confronted with another agreement, that is the SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, which has been proposed by the United States. So, the history of it actually is, SOFA is an agreement that had been signed about 20 years ago by a previous administration. But of course, it was basically innocuous type of an agreement with very limited number of features that we should be concerned of. But of course, in 2017, a draft of a new SOFA was provided, which is quite different from the original SOFA which we have signed. Then the second thing is the ACSA agreement, which was signed in originally 2007, and expanded format of that was signed in 2017. So ACSA is an agreement that has been done and finished.
And we can't revisit any of it.
We can't revisit. Only thing, we can give notice, 3 months notice or whatever it is, and we can come out of it. But again, I personally am aware where Sri Lanka was benefited. Sri Lanka was benefited because it was a reciprocal kind of an agreement during a time when Sri Lanka was still involved in the armed conflict. Since ACSA is a done thing, which some people seem to forget, we have to put it out aside, unless otherwise government want to take it back, and I don't think it was signed by the previous administration, and the current administration renewed it. So both administrations seem to have seen some benefits coming out of that particular agreement. So what kind of an administration that would go out of or pull Sri Lanka out of ACSA, I can't see that, because two different administrations.
But this ACSA agreement, the renewed version, is a more expanded version.
Fine. What we are talking of, one administration signing original ACSA, second administration signing the expanded thing, agreement, and whether the future government would like to renegotiate it or not is a question which we are not competent to discuss at this point of time. Then we come to SOFA. It's a totally different agreement, not reciprocal like ACSA. We provide facilities for the US forces to come into the country, no passports, no visas, and they could wear uniforms, they could carry weapons. If they carry weapons, I also believe they can fire also weapons. And more than that, contractors who get contracts from the government of the United States, who will follow the forces, will also have certain amount of facilities. And of course, if they indulge in criminal activity, they cannot be charged according to the laws of the country. And if there is a mere traffic accident and Sri Lankan get killed, the person will not be answerable to Sri Lankan laws. So the whole question is whether this is something that we should give our approval.
Right. I think I'd like to talk more on that. We'll take a short commercial break here at Hyde Park. To stay with us. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park. Mr. Goonetilleke, you were talking to us about the status of forces agreement that is under discussion with the United States. You are of the view that this is something Sri Lanka should reconsider.
Let me say something on the SOFA agreement. As I said earlier, the draft was made available to the government of Sri Lanka in 2017, maybe around September.
Okay.
So that was 2 years ago. That was just floating around, not being pursued for whatever reason, and it came up very recently when the MCC issue was being discussed. When it became a, what shall I say, a controversy, at certain quarters of the government came out with the proposition that actually this is not what we are going to sign. It is VFA, it's a different kind of an agreement. So we are talking of two different agreements, but so far as I know, there is only one text that is available. So visiting VFA means visiting forces agreement. The response, the response was, we are not going to station forces here, they are going to be visiting. But apart from this heading, the contents of the agreement remain same, there is no change. So
but
we must
this
not
is
get
the same agreement in different name.
Different name. So we must not get, we must not misunderstand the terminology that has been used. SOFA and VFA. My person, actually, we are not privy to the document. All what we know is what was published in the newspapers and elsewhere. But of course, one can also read so far agreements that have been signed by the government of United States with large number of countries. So this is not a unique kind of an agreement that is to be signed between the USA and Sri Lanka. Maybe 50, 60 countries have signed these agreements with the USA. The whole question is whether Sri Lanka should sign this agreement with the United States. What benefits Sri Lanka get out of signing this agreement? I do not have an answer to give to that particular question. What benefits we as a country or Sri Lankans as citizens would get by signing this agreement? So that I think the proponents of the agreement will have to explain to us so that we know better what is there for us. So for us, I mean, this is not clear. This is one of the problems that we have with the current administration or any administration. They do not wish to share information on what they are doing or what they are negotiating, whether it's a trade agreement or this kind of an agreement relating to security of the country. They do not have the habit of making it transparent. So people have to imagine. Individuals will have to come up with stories, sometimes partially correct, sometimes totally off the mark. Like what I said earlier about the MCC railroad all the way going all to Trincomalee, cutting the country into half.
There is also space for the Sri Lankan side to negotiate these deals and take up the concerns of the Sri Lankan side, but this hasn't happened yet. Is this a tendency we see not just this government, but of administrations of the country?
If there is a problem really with regard to agreements, is that our inability to negotiate properly with our counterparts, whether it is in the United States or trade agreement with Singapore or trade agreement with the United States. Trade agreement with China. Whether our negotiators are competent, our negotiators, whether they consult, if the trade agreement, whether they consult the trade, if it is a security thing, they consult the security, or whether as a group they negotiate and come up with a draft about which the population has no information whatsoever. So then it leaves room for speculation. So this is what has happened with regard to ACSA so far, as well as MCC grant. So actually speaking, this government or future governments should come out with this kind of agreements and educate the people, make them know what they are discussing, and then of course do their negotiations, undertake their negotiations, bring that to a conclusion. That doesn't happen in Sri Lanka.
We've spoken at length about these agreements that are subject to controversy, but very quickly, we have very little time on the program. I'd like to focus a little on Sri Lanka's foreign affairs and the UNHRC. As a former diplomat, permanent representative to the UN back then, do you think it was right or it was acceptable that Sri Lanka co-sponsored the UNHRC resolution when it was presented? What is your view? Especially because this is a question continuously. And even with the appointment of the army commander, there were certain allegations leveled, concerns raised by Western powers. And the opposition was that the government has readily accepted these proposals and recommendations put forth by the UNHRC. What is your view as a former diplomat?
Well, I have fairly extensive knowledge about the human rights situation in the country at a particular time. In the foreign ministry, once I was functioning as director of human rights division. I had taken part in the, or been a member of the Sri Lanka delegation to Geneva within a 10-year period, maybe 7 or 8 times. So my knowledge is actually goes back to 1987, when we had a similar situation. There was a resolution on Sri Lanka or against Sri Lanka, as we normally call it, a situation of human rights, and that was forced on us, and we decided not to allow it to go through, and we contested it, and a series of negotiations. So much so, on the last day of the 2-week session in 1987 March, that is the last session of the last day, only there was an understanding in which we renegotiated, we allowed the renegotiated resolution to be adopted by the Commission, Human Rights Commission at that time. So the interesting aspect was, we did not ask for a vote because we consented to the terminology which we have amended, or we had amended. And we also, there was no question of Sri Lanka becoming a party to that particular resolution. We did not do it. So this is 1987 March. But we are talking about resolution 30/1, the situation was different. My feeling is that it was euphoria the new administration felt after winning the general election, and wanting to be crusaders of human rights, wanted to show the world that this is not anything against Sri Lanka, this is for Sri Lanka, and we would like to be part of it. That would have been the enthusiasm of the administration at that time, not fully understanding the implications of becoming a party to a resolution of that nature. Because in that we agreed to make available certain facilities, and agreed to allow certain things to be done in Sri Lanka to correct the human rights situation, which we could not have done without changing the constitution or without getting the approval of appropriate government institutions. I don't think there was, for example, consultation with the armed forces, because uniquely my experience is that we do it on our own. We don't consult anybody, even the stakeholders we don't consult. And as a result, we end up with this kind of situation. So basically speaking, once again, it is the style of our doing things, style of our negotiations, which brings us into certain difficulties, which we are now in, is because we did not understand the dynamics of Geneva and try to do things for people to see, the world to see. And in doing so also, there was another thing that happened, that for a long period of time, the non-aligned group or the developing countries in the Commission, the Human Rights Council, supported Sri Lanka. But all of a sudden, Sri Lanka dumped them into another group, or dumped them and joined and moved into the group of those who were accusing Sri Lanka all these years. So something goes wrong again. I really do not know how we are going to go back to those countries and say, please support us.
Thank you very much for your time here at our studios at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24.
Thank you very much.
Well, we had with us Mr. Bernard Goonetilleke, a former diplomat of Sri Lanka, joining us here at Hyde Park to talk about Sri Lanka, controversial agreements that Sri Lanka has entered into and may enter into, and also relations between Sri Lanka and the Western world. Of course, we could not touch on the topic of countering Islamophobia. We'll leave it for another day. Thank you for joining us at Hyde Park. Good night.